In December 1872, deep in the Atlantic Ocean near the Azores Islands, the crew of the Dei Gratia spotted a merchant vessel drifting silently through a wall of winter fog. The ship was the Mary Celeste. From a distance, the sailors assumed it was in distress, perhaps a snapped mast or a flooded hold, and moved in to offer help. But as they drew alongside, the rigging was still, and no one appeared on deck. When the boarding party finally climbed over the wet wooden rail, they stepped into a ship that seemed to be sailing itself. There were no distress flags and no sailors at the wheel. The salvage operation was no longer about repairing a vessel, but finding a crew that had seemingly walked into thin air. Below deck, the ship was a contradiction. The hull was dry, the sails were functional, and the vessel remained entirely seaworthy. In the cabins, personal belongings sat undisturbed in sea chests, and the galley was still stocked with months of untouched food and fresh water. There were no signs of a struggle, no bloodstains on the deck, no drawn weapons, and no evidence that anyone had been forced off the ship. Only one piece of equipment was missing from the otherwise pristine scene. The ship's single lifeboat was gone. The sailors had left a perfectly functional sanctuary. To solve the mystery, investigators had to identify the invisible force that would compel 10 experienced people to step off a safe ship and into the open Atlantic. The hold contained 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol, a cargo so valuable that its presence untouched effectively rules out a pirate attack. These final log entries recorded rough weather in the days leading up to the disappearance. However, the recorded wind speeds and temperatures suggest a vessel that was managing the conditions, not one on the verge of sinking. Standard maritime disasters like rogue waves or sea monsters failed to account for the condition of the ship. A catastrophic impact would have shattered the hull or tossed the cabins into chaos, yet everything remained in place. A mutiny is equally unlikely. Violent uprisings leave physical traces, and the orderly use of the lifeboat suggests a departure that was sanctioned by the captain. With external attacks and internal violence unsupported by the evidence, the crew's departure looks less like a frantic escape and more like a calculated, temporary choice that ended in disaster. The focus of the investigation eventually shifted to the chemical nature of the cargo, the 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol trapped in the dark hold. If rough seas caused leaks, invisible combustible vapors would expand below deck, creating a terrifying threat of explosion. Fearing the ship was about to blow, they evacuated into the lifeboat, keeping connected by a tow rope to return once the danger passed. This survival tactic was sound in theory, but it placed the entire crew in a tiny, vulnerable boat at the complete mercy of the elements. While the crew waited for the threat to subside, the weather turned. Violent swells and sudden squalls began to batter the small lifeboat. Under the massive strain of the drifting merchant ship, the thick tow rope stretched to its limit and finally snapped. In an instant, the crew was separated. They could only watch as their ship, still fully stocked and seaworthy, caught the wind and sailed away faster than they could row. The very act they performed to escape a perceived explosion became the mechanism of their doom, leaving them stranded in the open sea. The sweeping currents of the Gulf Stream, visible in these directional markers, carried the Mary Celeste toward discovery, while pulling the small lifeboat into the vast empty reaches of the Atlantic. Despite years of searching, no bodies were recovered, and no final messages were ever found. The ocean left behind no physical evidence of their fate. 10 people vanished without a trace, leaving only an abandoned ghost ship to serve as a permanent record of the ocean's